The heirs reclaimed the papers, and it led to a fascinating lawsuit presided over by the late Judge Gunnar Nordby, in which the heirs reclaimed the papers, the society claimed the papers, and then the federal government jumped in and argued that they were original federal records. It ended up with the decision going in favor of the heirs, the society losing the papers, and the heirs selling the papers to Yale University.
And so you have, of course, in addition to the papers we talked about, very extensive collections. For example, the railroad Northern Pacific. Is this the Northern Pacific Railroad collection?
This is the guide to the Northern Pacific collection, one of the tremendously rich resources at the Society, which really illuminates the story not only of the Northern Pacific in Minnesota, but the Northwest, the settlement, the emigration, the study, or the story of Glacier National Park. A corollary collection are the papers of the Great Northern Railway. So this is a collection of immense regional significance.
And alongside the papers are all the many, many artifacts that the Society has collected. Well, first we should say a word about the newspapers.
The newspapers, which are in process of being microfilmed to preserve them, represent a very complete collection of probably 2/3 of the newspapers ever published in Minnesota. Here's an example of the headline the day Lindbergh landed in Paris in 1927.
And now about the artifacts that I mentioned a moment ago, the many, many artifacts that the Society has collected.
The Red River ox cart that you see here that figured so prominently in the fur trade in the 1840s represents one of the oldest artifacts. The printing press that is shown here in the Donnelly exhibit is the James Goodhue Press that published the first newspaper in Minnesota. And the largest artifact, the William Crookes locomotive that is on exhibit in Duluth in the Lake Superior Museum of Transportation, speaks for itself. Some of our exhibits go outside of the Historical Society. The replica, which is the centerpiece of the Charles Lindbergh exhibit, the replica of the Spirit of St. Louis at the St. Paul, Minneapolis airport, where millions of people see that each year.
Russell, in addition to papers and artifacts, of course, here's another key artifact, right?
One of the most recently acquired items in the collection is Yankee Girl, the boat that Jerry Speece of White Bear Lake made history with when he sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in that small boat a few years back. And Jerry donated that to the collection.
I started to say a moment ago that in addition to the papers and the artifacts, there are exhibitions that you have run so many of over the years.
Well, again,
we ought to recite a few of the key ones.
Yeah, again, the collections make these exhibitions possible, the collections and research. And one of the finest exhibits, we think, that received a lot of accolades and traveled around is Where Two Worlds Meet, the story of the fur trade that shows the interaction between the Indian culture and European culture and represents the first statewide industry in Minnesota. Another very popular exhibit was that of Ignatius Donnelly, a favorite I know of yours and mine. Donnelly, this inventive, creative science fiction politician of the 19th century. Family history is always a popular subject at the Society. This exhibit was developed by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin and came to Minnesota on a traveling exhibit route.
This one is a special interest to my family. This is a picture of my wife and my late mother-in-law. We'd gone over to see the quilt exhibit because of our daughter's interest, and I took some pictures and sent them to her.
One of the most popular exhibits, undoubtedly.
Russell, I want to proceed from what we've talked about here to another big dimension of the Society's operations, namely the publications. You have a huge publications program. We haven't got time to go into all of them, but just quickly, what are some of the key ones that we might refer to?
Well, the publications range all the way from very scholarly, definitive works such as this encyclopedic study of ethnic groups in Minnesota that was led by our late Assistant Director June Holmquist. More recent publication, our ethnic cookbook that not only has some marvelous recipes, but reflects the rich cultural mosaic of the ethnic composition of Minnesota. a biography of our most famous Indian leader, Little Crow, who led the Sioux War of 1862 by Gary Anderson. Highly readable and authoritative work. Another popular publication is that of Charles Lindbergh's, his account of his Huckleberry Finn-like boyhood on the upper Mississippi. Beautifully written a few years before he died in 1974. And then our staple publication, our quarterly magazine, that is almost 75 years old now, Minnesota History. And this is a great outlet for scholars around the country. And then the publication for schools, Roots, which has a wide audience, not only of school-age children, but adults.
Well, going beyond the whole matter of publications and exhibits and all that we've talked about is the preservation of landmarks. And that's a dimension I think that people just sort of take for granted. Take us through the whole question of major landmarks and local preservation and those that we've been able to save and those that we've lost.
Well, there's no better place to begin than Fort Snelling, which in many ways is the birthplace of Minnesota, commanding the bluff at the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Here you see it in a painting back in the 1830s. Fort Snelling, I think, did much to dramatize the need to preserve our historic places. It was the site of an early state fair in the 1860s. I think this is the second state fair. For a long time after Fort Snelling fell into disuse after the late 19th century, the Round Tower came to symbolize it. And it was only during the statehood centennial of 1958, which you'll remember, that there was a major effort to completely restore Fort Snelling. And archaeology and architectural research made that possible. Here is the fort completely restored, and it's virtually completed as a project. Some of the prairie around it has yet to be restored, but that's in the works. Another popular site is the Lindbergh home at Little Falls, important in aviation history and the story of the Lindbergh family in Minnesota, but also unique in that the principal character, Charles Lindbergh Jr., was still on the scene and worked with us to restore the home, he and his sister Eva both. And Lindbergh supported us both financially and with moral support. Gracing that site, a beautiful site along the banks of the Mississippi, is a modern interpretive center that portrays his career as well as that of his father, who was an important maverick Republican congressman in Minnesota history, and his grandfather, who emigrated from Sweden and was a leader of the agrarian population in Sweden. Split Rock Lighthouse is one of the more recent sites to be developed, and it interprets the story of Minnesota's seashore coastline. Not only is the story of the lighthouse told and why it was built to provide safety for ships, but here you have the story of fishing in Minnesota, shipwrecks, shipping, and so on. Tremendous combination of scenery and history. The most recent and the last historic site to be acquired by the Society is the James J. Hill House near the cathedral in St. Paul. And Hill, of course, is well known as the builder of the Great Northern Railroad, the empire builder, and then the acquirer of the Northern Pacific and the Burlington Northern Railroads. It had a tremendous impact on the economic life of the region. A classic historic landmark, a national historic landmark, is the famous Owatonna Bank, the Northwest Bank in Owatonna, designed by Louis Sullivan with this wonderful glass and metalwork. And of course, not all of our preservation stories are successful. The Ignatius Donnelly loss in the late 1940s, the Ignatius Donnelly House was one of the major losses.
Was this at Nininger?
At Nininger near Hastings. But I think it had an effect in stimulating Minnesotans to be more vigilant about preserving major landmarks. I know former Governor Elmer L. Anderson said that the loss of that site converted him to historic preservation.
And here's another loss.
Another loss in the city. You served as mayor. The Metropolitan Building down in the Gateway area, which was surrendered to urban renewal. And
I couldn't have changed the course of history, but I came to regret very much that we didn't save that building at the time in the early 60s. But we have said, here's a success.
Here's a success in St. Paul, which may say something about St. Paul, which moved a little more slowly in urban renewal. But the old federal courts building there, overlooking Rice Park, is a home today of many cultural organizations, and I think helps define the historical skyline of St. Paul.
Can't resist, Russell, coming back to the Capitol as a landmark, because that must be the granddaddy landmark of them all.
No question about that, Art. It is the dominant historical monument in the state. I think increasingly people visit it for its historical and architectural gems. They certainly went first class when Cass Gilbert designed the Capitol. You have some of the finest mural painters in the United States represented there, outstanding sculpture. And I never tire of going through the Capitol.
I sometimes think it's underappreciated even as much as it is visited.
I think it is. I think it is.
And Russell, we ought to go on, though, to talk now. We talked so far about all the static things, but you have a very big program of living interpretation at the Historical Society, the outreach programs and the guided tours. Say a bit about that dimension.
All right. The restoration of Fort Snelling really provided the laboratory for this technique called living interpretation. We found that the static exhibits and the rather canned kind of tours we were giving with a set speech, people began to tire of that, or at least expect more. So we went into what is called role-playing, where the guides are dressed in the period and they act out a part, very authentically, backed up by research. At the Kelly Farm, we've introduced animals. Here you have two of the most recent additions to the staff. The two oxen showing plowing up the fields, and then the gathering of the crops at the Kelly Farm. And we find that this engages the visitor and provides a much more impromptu kind of experience. Again, we're at the Kelly Farm, gathering in the crops, and then they are threshed there by hand. And the Kelly Farm, of course, is significant as the home of Oliver Kelly, who founded the National Grange, the first successful national farm organization. Also, back at the museum in the main building near the Capitol, we carry on an extensive series of lesson programs. You see here a class that is studying a period of Minnesota history and receiving a lecture, but there's a lot of give and take. Another popular tour is the tour of the Capitol, and that's given every day of the week. Here we're in the most decorative room of the Capitol, the governor's reception room, and a group is viewing probably the most famous painting in the Capitol, Howard Pyle's Battle of Nashville, a Civil War scene. And then moving to Pine City, you find the fur trade represented, the state's first statewide industry. There a site was discovered and reconstructed of a British fur post. One of our most popular programs is the tour program. Here we're at Marine with a tour group, and one of the stalwarts of that program for many years was your mother-in-law, Marie Healy.
Right. And we mentioned in connection with the quilts a moment ago. Russell, there's another dimension of the society that I was sort of surprised to learn as we talked about preparing for this program, that the archaeological part is really a very major dimension.
The archaeology program, I think, has been revived. It was an early program, then kind of lapsed for several decades. Indian Mounds Park in St. Paul was one of the first archaeological sites to be set aside. So much of our history is related to native peoples, Indian tribes in Minnesota, and I think we're catching up to appreciate those cultures. This is an excavation at the Grand Mound near International Falls, the largest Indian mound in the state. And I think archaeology has done a lot to correct the records, such as here as at Fort Snelling. We could only reconstruct Fort Snelling if the archaeology were performed first, and that's what's happening in this scene.
And archaeology even moves from the land to the sea, to the water.
Our late Assistant Director, Bob Wheeler, pioneered this project with Dr. E.W. Davis, who developed the commercial process for taconite. Dr. Davis really wedded together modern technology and historical research here with Bob. Don Franklin is in this scene. He was one of our finest divers, and he and others explored the sites of mishaps, of accidents along the boundary waters. Here, Don is seen with Sigurd Olsen, who was a great supporter of that program. And it's amazing what they found from these canoe overturnings.
Russell, the course has not always been smooth for the Society. You've been involved in some rather important controversies. You mentioned the Lewis and Clark papers earlier on, but the one that really comes to mind is the runestone controversy.
Well, history is full of controversies and always being revised, but a cross that each director bears is the Kensington runestone. I happen to be on the skeptical side of that argument, and that's one reason I think I received so much mail, most of it adverse, chastising me for my skepticism about this inscription, which, if true, tells about an expedition into Minnesota in 1362 by a group of Norsemen. And if true, of course, that means that the Norse were in Minnesota before Columbus discovered America, and that's the crux of the dispute. It's a fascinating piece, though, I think, of Minnesota folklore, and does much to enliven many days when this argument comes up.
You know, though, Russell, the gentleman that that discovered that stone, he must have been a very bright and inventive man.
Olaf Ullman, I think, is much underrated. We're accused of maligning him because we accuse him of being deceptive and untruthful, but I think it shows he had a tremendous sense of humor at a time when there was an argument between ethnic groups over who did discover America. Well, there's still an argument. I think it's a rare piece of frontier humor perpetrated by Olaf Ullman.
Did he, before he died, I seem somehow to remember reading something that he's more or less confessed that this was a fake, or is that not true?
Not quite. I don't think he ever confessed, but we have tapes by 3 children of his next-door neighbor who testify that their father helped Olaf Ullman carve the stone. And I think the evidence is pretty persuasive that that's true.
Russell, we've talked, of course, about the past, and that's only natural for the Historical Society discussion to be about the past. But let's talk about the future now. Great plans for the future. You're retiring at a moment when we're going to go into a huge new development. What's the situation now, and what does that lead to?
Well, the research center at 1500 Mississippi is a good example. The Society has been dispersed through its great growth around the Twin Cities. We're in 5 locations. We need to pull those collections and public functions together. And the new History Center will provide that. Here you see a model of the center designed by Hamill, Green and Abramson, a Minneapolis firm. And it will be located on the old Miller Hospital site between the Cathedral and State Capitol. So for the first time, we will have an adequate museum, we'll have modern library facilities, and parking for the public. It's an exciting development, and I think a new era in the Society's history.
Russell, I remember so well, though, the big argument that proceeded about the location. Now that the architects and artists have done their work and present you with the fait accompli of a beautiful new structure, do you feel better about the location?
Oh yes, I'm excited about it. You're quite right. We had a big argument in 1984, and we fought hard to stay where we were. We thought we had an excellent plan, but I think this plan will benefit the public even more.
Russell, $50 million for a structure, isn't that a lot of money?
It's a lot of money, but when you look at 140 years of history and all of the functions the Society carries on, I think it's a modest investment in the future.
As we close out the program, Russell, tell me about yourself. You can't be retiring, really, from any active work. you must have some rather definite plans for the future.
Oh, I do, and you would appreciate this. As a writer in Minnesota history, I have a large pent-up list of research projects. My two immediate ones will be to continue work on the papers of Charles Lindbergh, augmenting the book on his boyhood, and then a favorite longtime topic of mine, Floyd B. Olson, who's always intrigued me for his governorship in Minnesota during the 1930s. You've written about that period. You know what an exciting period that is. I think a very pivotal period in the history of Minnesota. So I'm looking forward to that.
So where will be your base of operations during that period?
I'll be at the Hill House with the Society, and that's a very pleasant environment to work in, and moving around, interviewing people.
And finally, what's the kind of general schedule now for the completion of the new center for the Historical Society?
This legislature, we trust, will make the big decision with the major appropriation, groundbreaking in the fall of 1987, occupancy in 1989 or 1990.
Russell, you've had really a perfectly magnificent career with the Historical Society. I know that your leadership is going to be missed, but we're looking forward to your continuing contributions in the field of Minnesota history. I want to thank you for all of what you've done for all of us who are interested in the history of our state. Thank you so much, and thank you for appearing with me, sharing these highlights from the career and the life of yourself and of the Historical Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Arthur Naftlin. I'll be back next week with another Minnesota issue. I hope you'll join me.
Tomorrow, drinking and driving, the toll, the tears. Across America, lives are being shattered forever by drunk driving. Now the victims, their families, and the drivers tell their stories. Can America solve the problem of drinking and driving, the toll, the tears? Tomorrow night at 8.
For information on how you can get an audio cassette copy of this Minnesota Issues program, write to Minnesota Issues, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis 55455. Or you may phone during regular business hours, 612-625-0351.
This January, escape the winter cold. Go down under to the land of the Australians at KTCA Global TV Festival beginning January 1st.
Presentation of today's broadcast schedule is brought to you in part by City Business, Corporate Report, Twin Cities Reader, and the members of Channel 2.
Live from the Met, a sparkling toast to the new year with Johann Strauss's beloved Die Fledermaus. Join Kiri Tekhanoa, Judith Blagan, Tatjana Troyanos, David Rendell, Håkan Hagegård, Michael Devlin, Franz Matsura, Otto Schenk, and conductor Jeffrey Tate as they waltz and polka through an evening of bubbling comedy and rapturous music. Die Fledermaus, live from the Met on PBS.
A special New Year's Eve presentation Wednesday night at 7. This is your Twin Cities public television station, KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Channel 2. The following program contains scenes to which some viewers may object.
Major funding for this program has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the African Development Bank. Additional funding has been provided by the following.
Trying to cover Africa is 80% impossible. It defies all logic.